So I'm delighted to be here with you today for kind of a reflective piece, really, as I've just changed roles. I worked in teacher education in Zayed University for almost 7 years, and I just moved jobs. So now I'm lucky enough to be working at Emirates College for Advanced Education, still working in teacher education, but more on the side of supporting English language development among our teacher candidates, because we have a different profile of teacher candidates. Currently, we're dealing with in-service teachers gaining a PGDE, or a master's, whereas previously I was dealing mainly with undergraduate teacher candidates. So it's led me to think a lot about something that I'm very interested in, which is translanguaging pedagogy, but also the other aspect of EAP, which is something I'm not as familiar with. And I'm thinking about ways in which I can implement translanguaging pedagogy into my own classroom and also help colleagues to do so. So as you know, I mean, I think you're all very aware of what English medium instruction is, and of course Dillon puts it very well, saying that it's in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English, but we're using the English language to teach academic subjects. And there's full English immersion at our institute. There was in Zayed University, where I previously worked, and there is at Emirates College for Advanced Education as well. So we can call that, as Gallagher says, late immersion. But the pedagogical implications of EMI are becoming more understood, but are still not sufficiently researched. So it seems that research is vital to establish what kinds of support and scaffolds that L1 students would need in order to make sense of texts in L2 in EMI contexts. Because a lot of what we ask our teacher candidates to do is read through the medium of English. And sometimes the type of reading we're giving those teacher candidates is, you know, at a very, very high level. And we'll talk more about the levels of English that our teacher candidates tend to have in this context. So, as I said, the aims of this presentation, it's almost in a way started off as kind of a personal reflection due to the fluidity of my role, which is bridging the gap between teacher education, so preparing teachers for working in classrooms, and English language support of those prospective teachers. And, you know, when we're in a fluid situation like that, there's always an opportunity in that to learn more and to reflect on practice to become a better teacher in whatever way we can be. And I'm interested in starting a research project in this area. I'm currently writing a couple of things about translanguaging, but more from a document analysis perspective. And I'm really looking for ideas with how I can contextualize this whole idea of a translanguaging pedagogy with my current teacher candidates that I'm working with in the in-service program and in our future pre-service programs. I'm not keeping an eye on the chat now because I know that Dr. Glenda is, so I'm just keeping my eye on the screen and not on the chat, so I can't see if you've got any questions, but we'll address them after anyway, in any case. So there are three main things that I want to talk about today about EMI in the UAE. So first of all, the linguistic context for teacher candidates or in-service teachers. There's so many things that we can call these same people, they're student teachers. So we need to look at the linguistic context in terms of their admission requirements and the levels of English that they need entering the profession and so on. We're also going to have a quick look at the impact of EMI on content learning. So does EMI have a positive impact, a negative impact? How do people feel about it? And then we'll have a look at what could the affordances of a translanguaging pedagogy be. So for teacher candidates in the context of the UAE, in any of the institutions, federal institutions where teacher education is provided, the majority of all content courses are taught through the medium of English. So in the past, there would have been pre-baccalaureate intensive English foundation programs for teacher candidates to reach a B1 level at CEFR. But since 2019, as we know, these pre-baccalaureate foundation programs have been phased out largely. And that's because teachers were entering into prospective teachers were entering into the major program with a sufficient level of English. However, English language support is still needed. Arabic is diglossic in nature, as you know. We have modern standard Arabic, we have the local Arabic, we have classical Arabic, and there are really great differences between the spoken and the written versions of the Arabic language. And it was I suppose I had an assumption that our teacher candidates would have higher levels of Arabic language than English, but actually when we looked at their scores across the first and second year at the university level, we found that actually the academic scores in Arabic language were at an intermediate level as well. So Emirati students tend to have lower than expected levels of literacy in modern standard Arabic. Professor Hanada Taha has written extensively about this, and she says one of the issues with this, why this happens even coming up to the university level, is that students are not trained at school to read deeply and to read quickly and for understanding. And that's an interesting thought as we enter the month of reading as well. So how can we get students to read deeply and quickly and for understanding in an appropriate way that will support their learning? So there is really a lack of research on the actual impact of EMI on content learning. We do have some concerns that students' comprehension might be compromised due to low levels of English language proficiency. We also have to acknowledge the difference between, CEFR level B1 and B2, because the difference is really quite significant in terms of readiness for academic participation. And if we look at what's expected at the B1 level in terms of writing, and then the B2 level in terms of writing, it's actually quite a large jump within that continuum, what students would be expected to do. And so while we do have these minimum language requirements, a 1250 MSAT, around between a B1, B2 CEFR, then, these minimum language requirements might be okay for students to complete their program of study. However, it might not be actually sufficient for them to realise their full academic potential. So basically, what I'm saying is Gulf Arabic speaking intermediate learners of English must be provided with appropriate scaffolding. And there was one experimental study conducted recently in the UAE by myself and my colleagues, Dr. Kay, Dr. Jazz, Geraldine Chell, and Dr. Ian Gray from UAEU. And we provided teacher candidates with the opportunity to access a piece of text in either English or Arabic and English. And actually our research indicated that learners benefit most from accessing textual content through the target language when it's presented along a similar version in their native language. I'm just going to show you what that looked like. So you can see here we have a short piece about make-believe play. One of the pieces is there translated one sentence after another from English to Arabic. The original piece was in English in the teacher candidate's textbook, an early childhood development textbook. And there we have the translation just in Arabic. And what we did there was we gave the different groups of 30 students each the text in either of those conditions, and then we asked them the same questions. And so across all of the sections of the comprehension test and the translation test, the group who had the piece of writing in English and Arabic did best across the board. So that was interesting. And it's not something we tend to do, but through this small experiment, we did see the benefits. Which brings me to translanguaging. And translanguaging is how bilinguals and multilinguals, of course, draw on their full linguistic toolkits. So, I'm sure many people in the audience here are bilingual or multilingual. And even if you only officially speak one language, you might think you're monolingual, but you'll have a lot of language awareness of various other languages. And that becomes part of your linguistic repertoire or your linguistic toolkit. And when we think about translanguaging, we're thinking about translanguaging in the classroom. I mean, we can look at it from many, many different perspectives, but we're thinking today about pedagogical translanguaging, which is the deliberate use of both languages, or not even both, multiple languages in the classroom. And the thing is, with EMI programs, we traditionally encourage students to draw upon the target language only, which in this case would be English. But pedagogical translanguaging entails the teacher planning intentionally teaching and learning activities while finding ways to draw on all the linguistic resources of the learners, not ignoring any of the linguistic resources, but rather drawing on as many as they can. And we can note the difference between spontaneous and pedagogical translanguaging. Spontaneous just happens naturally. We might start a sentence in English and finish it in French, or start a sentence in Arabic and finish it in Urdu, whatever it might be. This is spontaneous translanguaging. We used to call it code switching, but translanguaging is much, much wider, as we know. But pedagogical translanguaging is where we're actually thinking about this as teachers. And if we look across the developmental continuum, we can see that young children tend to actually fluidly support each other. They're not shy to draw on their linguistic repertoires. They translate as needed. They paraphrase in the language they feel most comfortable with. And these practices actually activate the sources that learners have in their linguistic repertoire. However, because of expectations within schools and institutions and so on, as learners get older, they tend to become socialized in monolingual practices, and that tends to hold them back from translanguaging practices. Often it's because of the environment in school. The teacher says, no, this is an English only time. Don't speak Arabic. I'm sure that has happened to many of you. I know it's happened to me in language classes before. And actually, I'm not sure it's the wisest way of moving forward. I recently came across a really nice article by Parra and Proctor, and they talk about the translanguaging corriente. And the corriente is a direct translation from Spanish current, which is like the current of the flow of a river. And sometimes we could think about the classroom being like going along in the current of the flow of a river as well. And now I'm thinking about it in terms of drawing on those linguistic practices. They place this corriente along a continuum between listening, channeling, and flowing. And so basically along this translanguaging continuum, first of all, listening is where the instructor is listening and just accepting the use of all the children's languages or learners' languages according to what they feel like saying at that given time. Channeling is where they're listening, being aware of those various languages in use, and beginning to notice opportunities for bringing those into pedagogy. And flowing is where instructors actually intentionally plan for what they're going to do with all those linguistic resources. So they're actually intentionally planning to bring Arabic into the classroom along with English. Now, but there are some varying attitudes about the use of translanguaging. Senos does talk about where teachers did implement a translanguaging pedagogy, learners' anxiety about learning through a second language was reduced, and teachers felt less guilty about using more than one language in the classroom. So we can see a kind of a guilt aspect to this.
Okay.
Probin talks about this being an opportunity to construct knowledge in a way that opens up opportunities. So while we see some benefits for translanguaging, like learners' anxiety about learning through the second language and that, we actually did this in a course. My colleagues Afaf Al-Batena and Kay Gallagher did this in some coursework at Zayed University during the Children's Literature course, where they offered the opportunity for a group of teacher candidates to shuttle between Arabic and English in the development of a children's storybook. And I think we expected them to enjoy doing that more than they actually did. There were many, many different opinions about this. So really we can say that they had paradoxical and ambivalent attitudes towards the practice of translanguaging. So this is something that takes a little bit more thought, and I think people see it as a bit of a vague concept as well. So I was going to ask you this question and give you time to respond, but I don't think I have time. So I'll just put it out there, and maybe you can think about this through the rest of the talks as we think about how we can enhance learning in the English medium instruction context. So how can we tap into this translanguaging corriente in monolingual teacher education contexts? I'll just put that question there for a moment. And if you want to put things into the chat, please feel free. I won't look at them now, we'll come back to them afterwards. And I'll go on and give you some of my recommendations for how we could tap into this translanguaging corriente. Some things we can do is, as instructors, we can intentionally listen to and observe and document how learners use their communicative resources to engage with texts in the teacher education classroom. One thing I've noticed while teaching teacher candidates is that in many of the cases of group work, they go straight into speaking in Arabic. And I saw that more when we were in-person teaching rather than online, obviously. But it was really interesting to hear them re-explaining those concepts in the mother tongue rather than in English and back translating. So creating that space where bilingual and multilingual practices are valued. So instructors need to open up spaces where sports are provided to learners to access the curriculum. Like I showed you in our study, offering texts in a second language, not just in Arabic, but both in Arabic and English presented together. Also, Qureshi and some colleagues have been working on specific glossary lists with conceptual explanations of education-related vocabulary. That could be provided to learners and offer some great help. And then scaffolding and differentiating instruction for learners through modelling translanguaging. So modelling how we think out loud. And that's really only possible if you speak the language of the learners themselves, which can be difficult with the context of teacher education instructors commonly in the UAE who the majority of don't speak Arabic, but might speak other languages. So if that is the case, instructors can be creative in channeling the corriente by seeking support from appropriate community members, like other students and peers, teaching assistants, or online resources. There is a challenge to academic writing in English medium instruction contexts. And again, here, teacher candidates could be encouraged to, paraphrase using strategies such as note-taking from the original source, but then mind mapping those notes using their main language, taking time to interpret them, and then back translating alongside those community and online supports. So the encouragement of think aloud protocols, where learners are afforded the opportunity to verbalize their thoughts while completing a task using their full linguistic repertoire, maybe thinking out loud in Arabic and actually writing in English at the same time. So in summary, what I'm looking to do is open up a translanguaging space where teacher candidates can develop their confidence and agency, where all of their diverse linguistic repertoires are harnessed as part of their funds of knowledge. And in order to do that, I'm looking to start a research project very soon with my teacher candidates. So I'll be really interested to hear any ideas any of you have to get me started there. Those are some of my thoughts and reflections and recommendations, but I'm looking forward to doing some field work in this area. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to discussing this at the end of the panel.